The Vancouver Canucks are weirdly addicted to Sweden. And no, it's not the meatballs or IKEA, it's the hockey players. Dating back to the mid-1970s, the Vancouver Canucks have always had a super Swede on their roster, leading their team. Even right now, they're led by Swedish superstar Elias Pettersson, who is easily one of the top centers in the league. But it's not even just the players that are Swedish. No, it goes much deeper. It's the management, the scouts, and even the fans. The Canucks entered the league in 1970 through the expansion that brought in both them and Buffalo, and at the time there were very few European players. The first was Swede Ulf Sterner, who debuted in 1965, but other than him and a few others, Europeans were not very common. For one, hockey just wasn't as popular as it is today. In today's era, there are some elite hockey programs all around the world allowing kids to start playing hockey at a high level very early. This leads to good development, and eventually some of those turn pro. But back in the 1970s, hockey was a much smaller game. It was mainly in Canada at the time, and any players that were very good in Europe often went to a European league. And because of all that, for the first 8 years of the franchise's existence, their roster mainly consisted of Canadians, and a few Americans here and there. And at the time, this was actually the case for most of the league as well. In the 1978-79 season, there were 447 Canadians in the league, while the rest of the nationalities added up to just 64 players, meaning that 87% of the league was Canadian. The very next season, though, didn't change too much, but it did change for the Canucks as they acquired their very first few European players, which, if you couldn't have guessed, were all Swedish. Following his rookie season in the SEL, Gradin was selected by the Chicago Blackhawks in the 1976 draft. Then he was traded to the Canucks for a draft pick. Eriksson was found after his great play at the 1974 World Juniors, and then was drafted by the North Stars in the following draft. He then broke into the NHL in 1976, leading all rookies in points in his first season, but after just 2 seasons with the North Stars, he signed with the Canucks. Lars Zetterström represented Sweden at the 1977 and 1978 World Championships, then signed as a free agent with Vancouver. And finally, Lars Lindgren was playing for Modo in the SEL, then signed with the Canucks for the 1978 season. And the first season with all 4 of those Swedes was kinda hit or miss. 2 of them made a big impact and returned the next season, and 2 did not. The 2 that returned were Thomas Gradin, who put up 51 points in his first season with Vancouver, and Lars Lindgren on defense, who put up 21 points. Zetterström and Eriksson parted ways with the club as they brought in a new Swede, Per-Olof Brassar. Now, I'm not going to go through every single season listing every single Swede that played on the Canucks, so here's a list of all of them that played a game with the Canucks up until 1991. Names like Thomas Gradin and Sundström struck out as they were a big part of the Canucks through the 80s, where they made the Stanley Cup Finals in 1982. Gradin played 613 games with the Canucks, posting nearly 600 points, which puts him 6th all-time in Canucks franchise scoring. Sundström didn't play as much as Gradin, but he still made quite the impact, going nearly point per game. His .91 points per game puts him 5th all-time in Canucks history. Then from 1991 to 1995, the Canucks surprisingly had 0 Swedish players on their roster. They did well during that time as they were one of the best teams in the league, making the Cup Final in 1994, losing in Game 7. Then just 2 seasons after that, the Canucks acquired one of their most franchise-altering players from the Pittsburgh Penguins, Marcus Naslund. Naslund was drafted by the Penguins, but after just 3 seasons in Pittsburgh, he was traded to Vancouver in what was one of the most lopsided trades in NHL history. The trade was 1-for-1. The Canucks sent Alex Stojanov to the Pens in exchange for Naslund. At the time, it seemed okay, as both players were young, and Stojanov had actually been drafted 8 spots higher than Naslund in the 1991 draft. But he went on to play just 45 games with the Penguins over the next 2 seasons, then became a career minor leaguer and retired by the age of 29. Naslund, on the other hand, would eventually play 884 games with the Canucks over 12 seasons, being captain for 8 of those years. But before he was captain, Naslund was still a 23-year-old kid developing his skills. In his first full season as a Canuck, Nazi put up 41 points through 78 games as they finished 15th in the league. Although missing the playoffs, this would end up being a very good thing for them as they landed the 13th overall pick and selected Swedish defenseman Mattias Öhlund. The Canucks were now building a solid team. On offense, they had players like Mark Messier, Alexander McGillney, Trevor Linden, Pavel Bure, Marty Jelena, and of course Marcus Naslund. The defense was a little bit weaker, but they did have newly acquired Öhlund, who they had high hopes for. Despite the pretty strong forward core, the Canucks struggled the next few years, constantly finishing in the bottom half of the league. On the bright side though, their young Swedes were developing nicely. Naslund was coming off a career high with 66 points, and Öhlund was among the best defenders in the league. And over the years that team was bad, they were drafting new players in hopes of turning their franchise around, but no selections were bigger than the ones they made in the 1999 draft. Going into the draft, Canucks GM Brian Burke had the 3rd overall pick and wanted to select one of the highly touted Sedin twins coming out of Sweden. But there was a catch. Daniel and Henrik were very good players alone, but together they were that much better, and because of this, they had a strong desire to play together. There were a few options for them to find loopholes in the draft to try and play for the same team, but they opted for going into the draft expecting to play on separate teams. That was until Brian Burke acquired the 2nd overall pick through a series of transactions, putting them in the perfect situation to draft both the twins. And just like that, Vancouver had picked both Henrik and Daniel Sedin, furthering their rebuild and strengthening their Swedish roots. A month following the draft, Henrik and Daniel signed their 3-year contracts with the Canucks, but would return to Sweden to play one more season with Modo Hockey of the SHL. When the Sedins finally arrived in North America, the Naslund-Oland era was slowly transitioning to the Sedin era. Through their first 4 seasons in the NHL, Daniel had 151 points and Henrik had 146 points. So they were good NHL players, but they were still sort of finding their footing. And as that was happening, Naslund had turned into a full-fledged superstar. In those 4 years, he dropped 353 points in 313 games, earning numerous award nominations like the Hart and the Lady Byng, but only won the Ted Lindsay in 2003. This dominant change was a part of his new role as captain, which he got at the start of the 2000 season. And after those first 4 years, it was the Sedins' turn to take a serious step. From 2005 to 2009, Daniel had 311 points in 327 games, and Henrik had 314 points in 328 games. Both were in the talks for the Selke and the Lady Byng during those seasons, as they became 2 of the league's best defensive forwards, while also putting up good offensive numbers. During this time, the Canucks' 2004 draft pick Alex Edler debuted in the NHL, joining Oland as another Swedish defenseman. Edler provided some pretty good stability on the back end, which they needed for years. And at the end of the 2009 season, the captain Marcus Naslund retired, finishing with 756 points, which currently sits 3rd in Canucks history. With Naslund gone, that meant the Sedins would have to step up offensively, and that's exactly what they did. In the 2009-2010 season, the Twins combined for 197 points, with Henrik winning the Art Ross Trophy and the Hart Trophy with 112 points. After this monster season, he became captain in 2010, after a weird stint that saw Luongo serve for 2 years after Naslund, but it was Henrik's turn. In the year he became captain, he and his brother dominated the NHL yet again, this time with Daniel winning the Art Ross with 104 points. Along with Henrik's league-leading 75 assists, the Twins took the Canucks all the way to Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Final, where they lost to the Boston Bruins. Canucks fans weren't all too happy with the loss, to say the least, and unfortunately that's all they would get in the Sedin era, as they would retire after the 2018 season. Both retired with over 1,000 points, both played in 1,300 plus games, and both had a .8 points per game. But the weirdest twin telepathy thing about Daniel and Henrik was their last game in front of the Vancouver Canuck fans. April 5th, 2018 was the final game the Sedins would play in Rogers Arena, and it was insanely special. If you don't know, Daniel wore number 22 and Henrik wore 33. This is going to be pretty helpful for this game, as these numbers come up a lot. Firstly, Daniel, assisted by Henrik, scores his 22nd goal of the season, 33 seconds into the second period. Then in overtime, Daniel, assisted by Henrik, scores again to win it 2 minutes and 33 seconds into overtime, which if you add the time to the third period, it would work out to 22 minutes and 33 seconds. And if that's not crazy enough, the faceoffs were 33-22 in the Canucks' favor. So really weird stuff that only Twins could pull off. Between the time of the 2011 Cup final run and the Sedins' retirement, the Canucks added some pretty notable Swedes to the roster. With Luongo on his way out, they went and got 2 young goalie prospects, Eddie Lack and Jacob Markstrom, both hailing from Sweden. Markstrom would eventually beat out Lack for the starting job and becoming the full-time starter for Vancouver. Louis Eriksson also joined the team, but at the time he was just a shadow of his former self. And now Edler had turned into a pretty solid number 1 D-man, passing Oland in all-time defenseman points for the Canucks. But none of them were quite superstars, and if there's one thing that the Canucks have had over the past 30 years or so, it was a super Swede. So with the Sedins on their way out, the Canucks selected Elias Pettersson with the 5th overall pick in the 2017 NHL draft. Now he was drafted while the Twins were still on the team, but he returned to the SHL as a lot of Swedes do. and in his draft year +1, he led the entire SHL in points, setting a new record for points by a junior player in the league. With all the hype surrounding him and the Sedins retiring, Canucks fans were eager to see him play. He made his debut in October of 2018, and in his first NHL game he scored a goal and recorded an assist, letting the NHL know that he's arrived. He finished his rookie season with 66 points in 71 games, winning the Calder Trophy and getting selected for the All-Star game. In the draft following Pettersson's rookie season, the Canucks would use their second-round pick to select Nils Hoglander, born in Bäcktrask, Sweden. Hoglander would, of course, though, hold off on coming to the NHL and would play the next season in the SHL with Rögle BK. In the meantime, Pettersson was improving his play, matching his rookie point totals, but doing so in 3 less games. And after that season, the Canucks parted ways with someone from their Swedish core, and that was their goaltender Jacob Markstrom. With the team signing Braden Holtby and Thatcher Demko coming up the system, Markstrom left to play in Calgary, where he signed a 6-year, $6 million contract, leaving Pettersson, Hoglander, Edler, and Eriksson as the sole Swedes on the team. But that would change as both Eriksson and Edler would leave the team. Edler left, signing a 1-year deal in Los Angeles, and Eriksson, along with a few other assets, were traded to the Coyotes in exchange for Oliver Ekman-Larsson, a Swedish defenseman. Then in January of 2022, the Canucks signed their 12th GM in their franchise's history, Patrick Alvin, who coincidentally was the first Swedish GM in the NHL's history. And his first draft selection as the Canucks GM was to select Swedish winger Jonathan Lekkerimäki. And Pettersson was just so good that they had to get another one, as in that same 2022 draft, they selected a second Elias Pettersson. Same name, same spelling, same country of origin. But since then, there haven't been really any major Swedish acquisitions. They drafted Tim Willander in the first round of the 2023 draft, they got rid of OEL, and they traded for Elias Lindholm in the back half of the 2024 season, which helped them get all the way to Game 7 in the second round where they lost to the Oilers, and then he signed with Boston in the offseason. So right now, currently rostered, they have just 2 Swedes, Elias Pettersson and Nils Hoglander. But it doesn't stop at the players. They of course have their Swedish GM, but along with him they have 2 amateur scouts that are Swedish. So obviously the roots run deep when it comes to the relationship between Sweden and Vancouver. 6 of the top 12 point leaders in the franchise are Swedish, and once Pettersson moves into the top 10, it'll be 5 of the top 10. The games played leaders are dominated by Swedes, and 3 of the 6 retired jersey numbers are occupied by Swedish players. It's clear that ever since the Canucks got a taste of the blue and yellow, they've become addicted. And with Lekkerimäki, Willander, Hoglander, and Petey, the tradition will run for a very long time.